What I would like to do today is to show you a different way to look at supply, this concept of supply and our supply curve. And we're going to do that by looking through a very specific lens that we call the theory of the firm. Now, we've been looking through that lens throughout our discussion of cost and profit and supply. And the basic way that the theory of the firm works is we look at things like production and cost and profit maximization and show how these things lead to the concept of supply. But there's more than one way to analyze this theory of the firm. There's more than one way to study how firms allocate resources. So we're going to start with our production function. We're going to rewind a bit and see it again. And what I want to remind you about is this. We know that firms will operate in stage 2. In stage 1, we can be more productive on average by increasing our output. In stage 3, we're actually overusing our resources and actively damaging our output. And today we're going to study closely where exactly in stage 2 that we're going to be producing given the economics around us. And exactly where we're going to be producing is going to be a function of two things: the input price, the price of X, the thing that we're buying to make our product, and the output price, Y, the thing we're actually making. If the output price goes up, we're going to produce more. That's the law of supply. And what you need to understand about that is when we produce more, we're going to need more of our variable inputs. So here's our production function. I've added to our production function one thing, and that's this red line sitting in front of you. And that red line has a slope, and the slope of that line is going to be the price of our input, Px, divided by the price of our output, Py. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to push it over to our production function until it just touches the production function, so where it's tangent to the production function. And when that line that has the slope of the price ratios is tangent to our production function, that's going to tell us the appropriate quantity to make, Y1, and the appropriate input to use given those prices. It turns out that at that point of tangency, the marginal product is going to be equal to this slope of the price ratios that I've given you here. Now, I showed you all that because I want to show you this. If you were to scroll back to the previous slide, you'll notice that Py, the price of the output, is on the bottom of our fraction. And if the price goes up, then the thing on the bottom of the fraction gets bigger, and that's going to make the fraction smaller. 1/2 is a larger number than 1/12. So as the output price goes up, we end up getting a smaller, or this ratio is going to be smaller, this fraction is going to be smaller. And since it's the slope, that means the slope gets smaller, we get a flatter line. So the line flattens out as the price of our output goes up. Let me show you what I mean. So here we have a new line that I've drawn, and I've used 2's in our subscript notation to explain that this is the new prices. And now the price of our output has gone up. We get a flatter line. We do the same thing. We're going to drive that over to the production function until we find a point of tangency. And at that point of tangency, we get our output Y2 and input X2. And at that point right there, the slope of this new line is equal to the marginal product. And the thing you have to remember about our production function, it's got a different slope everywhere. So every different price mix we might see, or relative input-output price, is going to give us a different point on the production function when we go through this process. Now, all that was a lot of math and maybe a little bit confusing. We talked about things like tangency and slope. These are concepts you may not have seen since you took an algebra class. So I want to drop back for a second and just kind of ask, what's the point behind that? The point behind that is pretty straightforward. It demonstrates a very important fact about resource allocation. If the input that we're using in our production process is very expensive, or if the output is very valuable, the firm will produce close to where the marginal product equals 0. I'll say that again. If we've got a dirt cheap input, a nearly free input, or the thing we're making's got a very high price, is very valuable, that's going to cause our firms to move along the production function up to the very top of the production function where it peaks, and that's where the marginal product equals 0. And on the flip side, if the thing we're making is not particularly valuable, it's a low-priced output, or if the input we're using is very scarce. Scarce is another word for expensive, right? So we have a very expensive input, or we have a very cheap output. That's going to drive us to to the other direction, close to where the marginal product is equal to the average product. It might even drive us well past that point, and when we get past that point, it's not really worth staying in business, and that's where we're going to shut down. So we're not going to make this output when the output price is very low or when the input price is very high. And the point behind this is resource allocation. This is, much like our discussion of how our supply curve gets generated, a discussion of how firms respond to incentives. There is an incentive to produce things that are valuable. There is an incentive to not use things that are valuable. And what you have to remember is that as the output gets more valuable, resources, inputs are going to flow toward the production of that output. And scarce resources, resources that are very, very valuable, are not going to get allocated to low value outputs. They're going to get allocated to high value outputs. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. The more valuable the input, the more valuable the output has to be to justify using it. Think about a precious metal like gold. As I'm recording this, gold has been at some very high prices, and things that used to be made out of gold or gold plated just aren't anymore, because you're going to switch to some other type of maybe electrical conductor because gold's gotten expensive. And by the same token, copper's gotten expensive. And so we see more aluminum being used in wiring. It's all about the resource allocation. Valuable inputs can't be used to produce non-valuable outputs. It just doesn't make any economic sense. The other point that I want to always come back to when I discuss these types of things is the slope or the margin. Anytime we do some kind of optimization, a slope or a margin is going to come into play, because a slope is a margin. They're basically the same thing. So always kind of be on the lookout when we're going through this process of understanding resource allocation for the marginal version of whatever it is we're studying, because the marginal is going to be equal to 0, or the marginal is going to be equal to some other thing anytime that we get to the point where we've made the right choice with our resources. So that's the end of this set of slides. Thank you very much for playing along. As always, I'll have some more coming along shortly.